What's up guys, Sagi here and welcome to another Tech Gear Talk. Today we're going to check out the Fuji X-T30. Now this new 26 megapixel camera from Fuji has a lot in common with one of my favorite cameras on the market, the X-T3, and at an even more affordable price, which is saying a lot. I'm going to walk you through a detailed review, show you some sample photos and video footage, and then talk about who I think this camera would work for. At $900, the X-T30 is in direct competition with cameras like the Sony a6400 and the Canon RP. And the X-T30 combines Fuji's latest autofocus system, lots of controls, and a tilting touchscreen all in a small and portable body. I'm going to cover what I liked and what I didn't like about the X-T30, and then I'll give you some final thoughts. I'm going to very quickly go over some overall key features in case you're just starting your research. So the X-T30 features a 26.1 megapixel APS-C CMOS sensor and the X processor 4. It uses a hybrid autofocus system with 425 phase detection points that cover nearly the entire sensor. It has a 3-inch 1.04 million dot two-way tilting LCD touchscreen and a high-resolution OLED electronic viewfinder. You can internally record 4K 30 at up to 200 megabits per second, and there's super fast continuous or burst shooting at up to 30 frames per second. It can handle full HD or 1080p at up to 120 frames per second for great slow motion, and it has integrated Bluetooth 4.2, which allows you to wirelessly share images to your mobile device or use the device to remotely control the X-T30. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, let's dive in deeper and talk about the good and the bad. I want to start out by talking about the sensor and the processor. The X-T30 uses the same X-Trans BSI CMOS sensor that Fuji used on the more expensive X-T3, and if you watch my X-T3 review, you know just how impressed I was with that sensor. BSI, or backside illuminated, simply means that some of the elements were removed to the back of the sensor with the goal being better low light performance. So not surprisingly, I was very happy when using the X-T30. And I found the quality to be very good with excellent dynamic range and Fuji's beautiful colors. Now the X-T30 is a fantastic option if you're shooting portraits, sports, landscape photography, if you're doing street photography, or if you're looking for an excellent all-around travel camera. Overall, I think it's a very pleasing image, especially for portraits, and I really like the color processing and the improved low light performance for stills. Like with other Fuji cameras, I liked having the ability to select from 3 different dynamic range options, which allowed me to bring more detail out of the shadows, as long as I didn't mind increasing the minimum ISO. So when you're shooting in situations where there's a significant discrepancy between the brightest and the darkest parts of your scene, the X-T30 is going to be able to maintain detail in both the shadows and the highlights a lot better than a camera with a more limited dynamic range. Now moving on to the processor, Fuji opted for the X processor 4, which really gives the X-T30 a ton of power. For starters, simple operations like startup, going from shooting to preview mode, or just in and out of the menu and selecting different features and settings is very fast. Now, if you've watched my reviews before, you know that one of the things I look at with every camera is continuous or burst shooting. And this lets me just hold down the shutter and the camera will just keep firing. And this is a nice feature if you're photographing kids running around, if you're at a sporting event, or if you're trying to photograph your pets, or really any time when you're shooting a fast-moving subject. Now, one of the reasons that I said the X-T30 is a good option for sports is that the powerful processor lets me shoot at up to 30 frames per second when using the electronic shutter. Now this does come at the cost of a 1.25x crop, but you can get rid of that crop if you're willing to step down to 20 frames per second, which I think is still really fast. And if you want to switch over to a mechanical shutter, we're now looking at 8 frames per second. An advantage of the electronic shutter is that there's no blackout. So when you're using a mechanical shutter, the screen or the viewfinder go black with each exposure. And if you're trying to follow the action and there's a quick change of direction, you might miss it. With the electronic shutter, because there is no movement of the internal parts during the exposure, it's able to capture images without interrupting the view on the EVF or the LCD. I want to point out that when shooting at 30 frames per second, the buffer can handle up to 26 images when shooting JPEGs and 17 when shooting RAW. And when moving down to 8 frames per second and using the mechanical shutter, you can get up to 90 JPEGs and 18 RAW images. So this comes down to what you need. For my purposes, I don't ever shoot even close to 26 consecutive images because it's just not how I shoot. But if you're someone who is looking for that type of performance, then there are other options on the market that might be better for you. In addition to this video, I'm also working on a couple of follow-up videos and tutorials, and they'll have to do with things like my video settings and low light shooting and a few other things. So if you're interested, make sure that you're subscribed and you have notifications turned on. Now, if you have anything else that you want me to cover in those videos, please let me know in the comment section below. From a video standpoint, the X-T30 can record internally at up to 4K 30 420 8-bit video and 4K 30 10-bit 422 externally using a clean HDMI out. And in my experience, both formats give you fantastic footage and a ton of color info to work with when you're grading your footage. Finally, having a clean HDMI out also means that the X-T30 can easily be used for live streaming. Now let's get to something that was disappointing when it comes to video. If you choose to record video internally, there's a record time limit of 10 minutes in 4K and 15 minutes in 1080p or Full HD. Now that's a substantial limitation when compared with pretty much any other recent DSLR and mirrorless camera that have a 30-minute recording limit. Not to mention cameras like the Sony a6400 that have no recording limit at all. So I just wanted to let you know that if you're someone who regularly records longer clips, that's just something that you might want to keep in mind. It doesn't mean that you can't choose the X-T30, but you might choose to record externally. Okay, let's move on. And I say this all the time, but one of the most important things to me with any tool that I use is ergonomics, and that's both in terms of handling and functionality. And it's something that I think is overlooked by a lot of people when they're choosing a camera. The X-T30 is on the smaller size when it comes to Fuji mirrorless cameras, and it's definitely smaller than the X-T3. As technology advances, manufacturers are able to make certain components smaller, but I think it's important to strike a balance between performance, ergonomics, and portability. Overall, it feels like a very solid and well-built camera. And that's something that's hard to convey in video, but at the same time, I wanted to share that with you because I did notice it right away. On the other hand, the grip on the X-T30 is quite small, and you might find yourself wanting a slightly more secure grip if you hold your camera with one hand. For my hand, I can only fit 2 fingers on the right side when my index finger is on the shutter and my pinky ends up going under the camera. Again, because the grip is so small, I felt like I had to be pretty careful with how I handled it, and I had to hold it pretty tightly. There are plenty of buttons and dials so you can control most of what you need without having to go into the menu. A neat feature about Fuji is that you can assign functionality to a button by holding it down for a few seconds, and you don't have to go into the menu. There's a shutter speed dial on the top, as well as one for exposure compensation, and there is a front command dial and the rear command dial for dedicated and more precise control. On the left side, you'll see the drive dial, which lets you very quickly go from movie mode to bracketing options, single and continuous shooting. I also like the fact that Fuji implemented a focus stick, which is this little joystick on the back that you can use to move the focus point around. The joystick is also used instead of the 4-way arrow controls that we often see on other models. Getting used to Fuji controls can take some time, especially with its unique implementation of manual controls. On top of that, I found myself inadvertently hitting the Q or quick menu button pretty often because of where it's located. And that's not something that was happening to me with the X-T3. A feature that I really like the Fuji implemented is the view mode button next to the viewfinder. This button lets me alternate between the view being LCD only, viewfinder only, or have it use the sensor so that when I put my eye up to the viewfinder, the view shifts from the LCD to the viewfinder automatically. And the reason why that's important to me is that if I leave it on the sensor option, then when I try to use the LCD for focus, then when I bring my finger close to the camera, the sensor triggers this switch and the view disappears from the LCD and goes to the viewfinder. With some other cameras I used, I have this setting, but it's in the menu, which is just a lot less convenient. And with the X-T30, it's just a quick click of this button and I can easily alternate between different modes. Now this may seem like a small thing, but for me, it really improved the overall user experience. Now moving on to battery, the X-T30 uses the NPW126S lithium-ion battery, which gives it a rating of 380 shots. It's not the greatest, but it's still a little better than the a6400. Now on the left side, we have a little barn door with an HDMI out, a USB-C port, and a 2.5mm input jack. I like the design of this door and I didn't feel like it got in the way. It's great to see Fuji using USB-C instead of micro USB, and you can use the X-T30 while it's charging. I do find it a little odd that Fuji is using a 2.5mm external mic input instead of the much more commonly used 3.5mm, so you're most likely going to need an adapter for your microphone. I also wanted to mention that even though the X-T30 is really well built, it's not weather sealed, so don't plan on taking it out shooting in the rain. Now moving on to the bottom of the camera, we have the battery compartment, which also includes the SD card slot. I'm not a big fan of the placement of this compartment because the '20 on the bottom is right next to the battery door, so there is no way to replace the battery or remove the card when you have like even the smallest quick release plate attached to the camera. The viewfinder is a very nice 2.36 million dot OLED EVF, and you can select between a refresh rate of 60 and 100 frames per second. This is a nice feature to have because higher refresh rates can lead to better user experience when panning or when you're following a fast-moving subject. We also have the Sports Finder mode, which we saw in the X-T3. And with this mode, there is a 1.25x crop, and you'll see a frame around the area that'll be captured. And this is helpful because you can see moving subjects before they actually enter the shooting area, and that lets you anticipate the action. Now, the downside is that the resolution is lowered to 16 megapixels from the original 26 megapixels. As far as the menu, I found it pretty easy to use. Fuji uses a vertical menu system instead of a horizontal one that you see many other companies use, but it's fairly simple. Everything is broken into categories that make sense, and I didn't really find myself having to spend a lot of time searching for specific options. Next, I want to talk about resolution, frame rates, and image quality. For stills, the X-T30 has a maximum image resolution of 6,240 by 4,160, which I always think is plenty for what most people would ever need, again, unless you're printing something absolutely huge. It can of course shoot in both JPEG and RAW, so you can decide just how much information you want to capture depending on what type of editing or post-processing you plan on doing. Like with the X-T3, the image quality for stills is excellent, and I found that my images were sharp with very good dynamic range. JPEG noise reduction is excellent for a camera under $1,000, and I really like the Fuji colors, specifically when shooting portraits. I already mentioned the 3 dynamic range modes for JPEG shooters when I was talking about the sensor and the processor, and you're going to be able to select between the 3 available settings depending on your shooting conditions. Not surprising, of course, the dynamic range when shooting RAW is also very good, and you'll be able to comfortably maintain detail in your highlights and your shadows. For video, if you're shooting an NTSC, the X-T30 can record 4K video at 24 and 30 frames per second, and Full HD or 1080p at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second. In PAL, you can shoot 4K at 25 frames per second and Full HD at 25 and 50 frames per second. There's also a high-speed movie mode which lets you capture Full HD or 1080p at 100 or 120 frames per second and then play it back at 24, 25, 50, or 60 frames per second for slow motion. Now, this is similar to shooting in Sony's S&Q mode, if you're familiar, where the clip is already slowed down to the playback speed that you selected. But unlike Sony, there's a 1.3x crop when you're shooting in this mode. On the other hand, a big advantage of the X-T30 is that there's still face and eye detection when you're shooting in high frame rate, which makes it really easy to keep a face in focus while you're shooting slow motion. Now, something that many video shooters need to consider is the 10-minute maximum recording limit when shooting 4K, and the 15-minute recording limit for Full HD. My best guess is that this was done to prevent overheating, but as I already mentioned, this is a significant deviation from the industry standard of 30 minutes. Now, the X-T30 can internally record up to 4K 30 at 420 10-bit, as well as up to 4K 30 422 10-bit via a clean HDMI out, both at 200 megabits per second. Now, if you're shooting in 4K, the footage is oversampled from 6K, which ends up looking great. The 4K footage from the X-T30 was very good, and I'm super impressed with this quality for a sub $1,000 camera. Footage was sharp and detailed, and it had beautiful color. Now, going to 1080p, as I mentioned, there are a number of frame rate options at various bit rates, but you always want to choose the higher one to get the best quality. Now, naturally, the quality of the Full HD or 1080p isn't as good as the 4K quality, but I was still very happy with it, so if you choose to record in 1080p, you're not going to be disappointed. If you're editing in 1080p and you want the absolute best footage, you can still shoot in 4K and then downscale it in post. You'll definitely see sharper footage with more detail if you end up going that route, but of course then you have to deal with 4K files, so there's a give and take there. I have a dedicated video discussing the pros and cons of shooting in 4K, so if you're interested, I'll link to it up in the corner and in the description so you can check it out after this video. Now going back, the X-T30 has a nice collection of film simulations including Eterna, which provides a cinematic look with lower contrast and saturation. You can actually use Eterna right out of the camera if you're happy with that look, or you might still want to do some additional color grading to achieve the exact look that you're looking for. All right, next let's talk a little bit about autofocus. And I was really happy with the autofocus on the X-T3, and I was curious to see how the X-T30 would perform. I also wanted to see how the X-T30 would stack up against the X-T20, and I definitely noticed that Fuji made some improvements. The X-T30 uses 425 phase detection autofocus points, which essentially covered the entire sensor. There's no doubt that the powerful processor plays a part in the focus processor, and the results were fast and precise autofocus with very good face and subject tracking. I really liked being able to use the joystick to move the focus point, and it allowed me to quickly make changes when necessary. There are 4 autofocus modes in total: single point, zone, wide/tracking, and AA, which is kind of an easy way to alternate between the other 3 modes. Now, face and eye detection worked very well for me, but unlike with the Sony a6400, it didn't work when the person was wearing glasses. I will publish a more detailed comparison between the two, so if you're interested, make sure that you're subscribed and that you have notifications turned on. Now, all in all, face tracking worked very well when I was using it for portraits. As I mentioned in other videos, it's great to know that focus is taken care of and I can simply concentrate on framing. One thing to mention is that if face tracking is turned on, it will always overrule your other autofocus modes. That means that if you're in single point autofocus and a person walks into your frame, the camera will shift focus away from that selected point onto that person's face. The solution is to turn face tracking off when you're shooting landscape and essentially any time when you don't need it. Overall, the focus system worked great for me for the types of photography that I do. Fuji has several autofocus setting presets that are designed specifically for different situations, so you may need to play around and find the one that best suits your needs. There's also a custom option that lets you configure the settings to exactly what you want. Now, moving to video, the Fuji autofocus is pretty good and again, noticeably better than the X-T20. Face and eye detection for video were very good even in low light, and the X-T30 was able to track a face even as the subject was moving through the frame and sometimes even turning away from the camera. I really like the flexibility of being able to control how much of a change the camera needs to detect before shifting focus, then how fast or slow it will rack focus. One thing that was missing is subject tracking for video. The X-T30 will track faces, but you can't click on a subject and then have the autofocus system track it as it moves through the frame. So to recap my opinion about the autofocus, for both stills and video, it's fast and accurate. All right, let's move to lens options for the X-T30. And I think a lot of people forget to look at this part when they shop for a camera. When I test cameras, I use a variety of lenses at different price points to help give you a true feel of what you can expect. What's really nice about buying a Fuji mirrorless camera is that there's an extensive line of fantastic lens options. There are a ton of affordable, really fast prime lenses, as well as some excellent zoom lenses, and I'll add links in the description to some of my favorites. One thing to remember is that because the X-T30 has an APS-C sensor and not a full frame sensor, there is a crop factor of 1.5x. This means that you have to take the focal length of the lens and then multiply by 1.5 in order to get the 35mm equivalent field of view. So for example, the 18-55, when I multiply it by 1.5, actually makes it a 27/83. What that means is that 18mm is not as wide as 18mm lens would be on a full frame sensor camera, but it's the same as a 27mm lens on a full frame sensor camera. The important thing is that you have a ton of options and you're not stuck with a fixed lens. That lets you buy the X-T30 with maybe just a kit lens or just one lens, and then you can continue to build on that as your needs grow. Let's move on and talk a little bit about the screen. The X-T30 has a 1.04 million 3-inch tilting touchscreen-ish LCD. You can tilt the screen up by more than 90 degrees for times when you're shooting from the hip or if the camera mounted low on the ground. And you can also use this when the camera is on a slider or for inverted shots on a gimbal. Another option is to tilt the screen down by up to 45 degrees. And that's helpful when the camera is mounted high on a tripod or if you're shooting over a group of people and you need to hold the camera up in the air, you're still gonna be able to frame your subject. Personally, I would have liked to see the screen tilt down a little more if possible, and ultimately I'm still a bigger fan of the fully articulating design that some other manufacturers use, but I can see that that's due to how I use the camera and it may not be an issue for every user. The screen is a touchscreen, so you can select focus points by tapping on an area when the screen is in live view. You can also use the screen to select focus area when you're using the viewfinder. If you're familiar with Fuji's quick menu system, then you'll be happy to know that you can use the touchscreen to select settings from the menu. To me, that created a great overall user experience, and sometimes I still prefer to use the controls and the dials, but I always like to have the option. What I don't understand is why you can't use the touchscreen with the regular menu. So with the quick menu, you can bring the menu up and then you can select features and then select a specific option. But with the regular main menu of the camera, you can't use this as a touchscreen. Seems weird. It's obviously able to detect touch. I don't know why they would do that. Moving on, I want to talk about a few other features that the X-T30 has that could help you make a buying decision. First, I want to talk about image stabilization. The X-T30 does not have in-body image stabilization, so you're going to have to rely on lens-based IS, which Fuji calls OIS. Fuji's kept this feature for its higher-end models, and this is something that was also not made available on the more expensive X-T3, so I wasn't really expecting it here. Next, I want to talk about time-lapse. And the X-T30 does not do in-body time-lapse, but it does have a built-in intervalometer. So you can select the interval time shooting option under shooting settings menu, and then set your interval in hours, minutes, and seconds, then finally set how many shots you want the camera to take. You then select how long you want the camera to wait before starting to shoot, and click OK to start. I did a video about creating a time lapse with the X-T3, and since the process is identical, I'll link to it up in the corner and in the description. Next, I want to talk about the flash. With the X-T3, Fuji provided an optional removable flash, but with the X-T30, we have a built-in flash. The operating distance is about 15 feet or about 5 meters at ISO 100. Now, naturally, you're not going to be able to overpower the sun with this flash, but it will give you additional light, and it worked well for me as a fill light during low to medium light conditions. Next, let's talk about connectivity options. The X-T30 has built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, which lets you use Fuji's Cam Remote app to pair the camera with a smartphone or a tablet so you can wirelessly share images and movies. This is awesome for when you're doing a shoot or maybe you're out on a hike and you took some great stills and you want to quickly post them to Instagram or to Facebook or wherever. You can quickly transfer them to your phone, give it a quick edit or not, and then post. What's nice is that Fuji didn't stop there, and they also added the option to control the camera for both photography and video using a mobile device. So for example, for photography, it's nice to be able to use my phone as a remote shutter. And that was great when I was doing product photography, for shooting macro or long exposures. For video, when I vlog or anytime when I'm in front of the camera, it's great to be able to control the X-T30 using the app. It's really nice to be able to make sure that I'm framed correctly, start or stop the video without having to get up, walk behind the camera, make a change, sit down and see if it worked. And that's huge because most of the time I'm working alone and I can literally use my phone as a remote monitor and control. There is a slight delay and sometimes a lag, but it's an awesome feature, and again, one that I used all the time. Next, I want to talk about another feature that people who shoot video are gonna like, and that's the mic input. And this lets you use an external microphone to get much better audio with the X-T30 than you're gonna get with the on-camera microphone. And I'll put some links in the description to a few options that I think would pair up really well with the X-T30, as well as a microphone comparison video that I did, which will hopefully help you choose. I mentioned this earlier, but I'm not sure why Fuji used a 2.5mm input instead of 3.5, and I don't know, I guess that was kind of frustrating. Another thing that is sometimes missing on other cameras is that the audio levels are always displayed when you're in movie mode, and that just really helps. So on some cameras, you have to go into the menu in order to see and then adjust levels. But then when you go back out and you're actually recording, you can't see your levels, which isn't great because you can't tell if anything changed or if the audio is all of a sudden clipping. So it's great to be able to see the levels, but what I couldn't do is modify the audio levels while recording. And if there is a way to do this and anyone watching this knows how to do it, please let me know in the comments section. Okay, so I think the X-T30 is an excellent option if your budget is under $1,000 and you're looking for a small and portable camera that can do a great job for both photography and video. For photography, the 26 megapixel APS-C sensor gave me outstanding image quality, and for video, I got great oversampled 4K footage. Autofocus was very good, and I enjoy using face and auto detection when shooting portraits. We can shoot continuously at up to 30 frames per second, and the camera controls can easily be customized in order to optimize user experience. The body is very well built and is on the smaller side, making the X-T30 a good option as a travel camera. The tilting touchscreen did a good job, although I really wish Fuji would have implemented a fully articulating screen design. Video quality was very good, but the 10-minute limit for 4K and 15-minute for 1080p is definitely something that you need to keep in mind. Autofocus has been improved when compared with the X-T20, and it worked well for face and eye tracking. We are missing subject tracking for video autofocus, and there is no image stabilization, but we have F-Log support and 10-bit 422 output for external recording. We have a sharp and bright electronic viewfinder. It only offers a 0.62x magnification, but does have a fast refresh rate. Remote functionality using the app is pretty good, and we have a built-in intervalometer, which I absolutely love. The body alone sells for right under $900, and I think it's a very good value if you're looking to get into the Fuji ecosystem with a powerful and very capable entry-level model. If you're ready for the next step up, you can always check out one of my favorite cameras ever, the X-T3. This is the first video in this series, and I have several more coming showing you my favorite cinematic settings and a low light tutorial. So if you're interested, make sure that you hit the subscribe and notification buttons. I'll put some links in the descriptions to the body, as well as some lenses and accessories that I liked, because there are always specials and discounts, and the links will automatically be updated with the lowest pricing. I really hope I was able to give you a good overview of the Fuji X-T30. If I did, please let me know by giving this video a thumbs up, tweet it, share it, and if you haven't yet, join the community by hitting the subscribe and notification buttons. You can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Tech Gear Talk. You know what I always say, buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.